I think the reason that I came to storytelling is because my grandfather had a bookshop and I used to work in that bookshop, and it meant that we were surrounded by children's books from a very early age. And I particularly loved East European collections of folk and fairy tales. I had a very happy childhood. It was like a fairy tale. And through friends of my parents, we were surrounded by people who'd been heroes in the war. I knew P.L. Travers, who was a great enthusiast of fairy tales. So there was a sense of magic in the air, and my life really was quite a fairy tale. That, going into the forest and lighting fires was not a mystery or something special. It happened all the time. I didn't feel that there was any break in the continuity of time. I felt that there were almost fairy tale characters around me, old men and old women, who'd walked out of fairy tales and were in my life. So I didn't see that world as being once upon a time and long ago, but rather it was part of the world I lived in. We lived in an old rectory, and it had a very long dining table, and there'd be 3 or 4 families there at once, and we'd have these long meals with adults and children together and candles burning, so there was a banquet going on permanently. Having shown absolutely no interest in drama at school, and never being involved in acting or plays or anything at school, I left school and for some reason wanted to become a mime. I think it's possibly because of David Bowie and Lindsay Kemp, and I saw the Lindsay Kemp shows, Flowers and things like that, when I was 14 or 15. But what I found I liked was fairy tales and myths, so I formed a little theatre company and we tried to make fairy tales into plays. We were very young, I was sort of 18 or 19, and we'd fallen under the influence of Peter Brook, the theatre director, who'd just come back from an extraordinary journey to Africa. And what I'd taken away from reading the book about that journey was an exciting idea, which was never to do the same thing twice. And we tried with our Paper Shoe Theatre Company to reenact or to create fairy tales that we knew, but at any moment we didn't know who was going to be which character, nor did we know when we did a show which story we were going to tell. There was a dice and it was cast, and if it was story number 5, then that's what it would be. And we'd set ourselves an impossible task. So I abandoned that and tried to do things with masks and puppets. And after a while I began to feel that the fairy tales that we were making in the real world, the visual world in front of us, bore absolutely no resemblance to what my imagination was full of. The idea of a storyteller didn't really exist back then until I read a book describing storytelling in the Caribbean on the island of Haiti, a book called The Magic Orange Tree, and suddenly a penny dropped and I thought, that's what we should do. The very first time I told a story in public, this was about 1978, I went to Portobello Road and I'd practiced telling a story, it was a Haitian story, a Magic Orange Tree story, in Richmond Park, and I'd been telling it to deers, and I took a drum with me and I chose a certain part of Portobello Road in a way just as it was leaving the posh bit from the antiques to the more hippie end as it was in those days, and I had a drum with me and I banged this drum and I was ready to shout, you know, for the first time in hundreds of years a storyteller is standing on the corner of the street. But everybody turned around to look at me, and I'm talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And I had an almost out-of-body experience because I found myself looking down at this little puppet who was sort of shouting the story out here, but I was sort of up on the rooftop there looking down and nothing to do with me. And so after that experience I thought, gosh, do I really want to do this? And then it was another 2 years before I actually stepped onto a stage in front of people and told stories. Storytelling is extremely powerful because we're from birth attuned to listening to voices. We learned our mother tongue. It's the principal form of communication amongst human beings. Fundamentally, it's one person who's the center of attention, and people are intrigued by that. Preachers, for example, are storytellers. Politicians also are storytellers. Comedians are storytellers, and storytellers are storytellers. So once you've got people in this very raw listening state, and the story that you're telling is actually happening right inside them, it's inside their imagination. They're not watching a story being enacted or played with on a stage. It's not outside them, it's inside, and it's been co-created. They've brought of their experience in response to the world to make it live. They have a sort of, whether they like it or not, they've participated in its creation, so therefore they're owning it. So the responsibility of the storyteller is considerable, because you don't want to put something poisonous inside people, and you could put something poisonous inside people. There are very many really shocking images. If you've shocked them, then how can you take them to somewhere where that image is rendered safe or is given a purpose? Because it would be an abuse of power just to monstrously fill people's heads with disturbing nightmares. They have enough of their own anyway. I like stories in which there is a very strong world with its own laws, physics and magical possibilities. I love to work with Bronze Age and early Iron Age stories, myths from the Celtic world, or myths from the Greek world, or myths from India, because I think it was at this moment where metal came into the world that society really changed, and it was possible for very powerful societies to evolve, and therefore the question of how powerful people used their power was being examined by the stories. The stories are very often about kings or tyrants and how they need to be brought back into place. I believe in magic in that the essence of magic is transformation. And for example, a storyteller or any performative artist can completely change the mood of an audience that's in front of them. So they are casting a spell, they are working an act of magic. It is enchantment, the singing of this transformation. Magical acts in a story can come either from outside, random agencies or seemingly random agencies, accidents, fate, or they're brought upon the characters by themselves in moments of decision making. They make the wrong part of themselves makes a decision. They didn't necessarily mean to do something, but they do something, and then everything flows as a consequence of that. So the magic that the stories are, one of the magics, many magics that they're talking about, is a sort of cautionary magic. Beware, be responsible, because whatever you do will have consequences. Waking up to that is a sort of a magical awakening. Sometimes you have to choose a story because you've been asked to find something that's very specific. That's kind of doing the job, but doing the storytelling as an artist, being led by your own muse or your own guide or your own demon, there I feel it's much more interesting to let something subconscious or instinctive or intuitive feel, I like this story. I don't know why I like it, but in telling it I'll discover why I like it. So you get into a sort of a relationship with the story. You dance with the story, you play with the story, and you give it something, it'll give you something back. And then you bring it to an audience and they'll see something that you didn't see in it, and you'll begin to understand why this story is so good. It's much more reciprocal, it's much more mutual. The story needs you, because otherwise it's stuck in the book. And you need it because you've got nothing to say without it. I've formed the Crick Crack Club because I've always enjoyed creating the context for storytelling. And because I'm a storyteller, I know how important it is to get everything right in terms of the audience, the framing of the event, the conditions in which the storytelling happens. I want the stories to be heard. I can't tell all those stories. I want other people to tell them. There are stories that I love that I know I don't have the skill to tell. So I will put those stories in the hands of other storytellers and say, you know, you might get something out of this. Is being a storyteller lonely is an interesting question. There is quite a lot of living with the story on your own, and quite a lot of being responsible for being the medium through which the story is travelling. So you're carrying, and if you really like the story, the responsibility of doing it well. And all these things are solo activities, but they're not necessarily lonely activities. There are many forms of responsibility when you become a storyteller, but fundamentally you're dealing with psychic energy. These things, you know, they've been around for a very long time, and when I use the word psychic energy, people groan, what do you mean? But on account of a story, and it's just a story, people will build a cathedral, people will slaughter others in their tens and hundreds of thousands, just because of a story. They're gifts. I mean, for me, this is as important as that seed bank in Kew Gardens, you know, with all the seeds of everything that's ever grown. This is the psychic produce of all our ancestors. I haven't had a holiday for 30, 40 years. I don't know what a holiday is.
Is he filming at the moment?
Yes, he is. He's filming you. With the hiccups.